Okay, thank you for inviting me along, Alastair and Clive. I've been involved in council science for a long time, so this, well, not that long, a wee bit of time. So the talk we're about to give is actually how we've actually approached providing science input into our community processes that we're starting up, and I'll take a few steps back and actually identify how we actually did it. Alastair is going to talk about the establishment of the Whaitua that we set up, in which we're using that as a mechanism to partly for the implementation of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, but also for much longer looking at the wider decisions that communities have to make around catchments. So you may ask, of course, why green, but it's yellow on this piece of paper. Why we're actually even thinking about a few years ago of repositioning science was looking at how we actually were approaching it in the past. And a lot of that revolved around sort of almost inadequate information to actually make good decisions. So we're looking at how we could actually better connect with the wider community around this, and what do we need as sort of institutional structural changes that might facilitate that. And there's also that transformation with their own internal scientists about how they may approach these problems. Because historically it was very much you provide information and then you run basically, and then you wait for the Environment Court or the hearing process to take place, and then you start this quite a litigious process. So we wanted to try and avoid that as much as we could. We were wanting to make sure that we were looking at more of a systems approach to things, and all this was kind of scary within the council dynamic. We were taking on additional functions. Historically, there was a lot of emphasis placed on water, very little placed around land, air and climate, even though there was NES for air. The climate side of it, we've only recently just boosted our staff to actually assist within that. And actually that just within a matter of weeks, we saw a different way of how some of the conversations we were taking internally. One of the key things that came out of the first year of looking at how we should reposition is that we actually were really operating in a social context. We were no longer just operating within a science fraternity and sticking within that. We're actually, strangely enough, trying to provide information to make better decision making, not providing science to further a science need. So it was very much an emphasis around the communication, and as a result we've actually changed internally to enable that by getting some science communicators and some science coordinators in to actually be that interface between the community and some of the more strict biophysical scientists, and we're still very much developing that. Those two areas are not particularly well resourced, I guess, within New Zealand, so finding those people has actually been quite difficult. Even though every time I talk to one of our scientists or any scientists, they are great communicators. They are able to deliver a graph like you wouldn't believe. So unfortunately that's a mechanism of communication and doesn't necessarily hit with everybody. The other thing that was really missing was if we're providing science, that should be actually influencing behaviours. And that just also starts right back at the very beginning. Why would they even turn up to listen to us? You know, what are the mechanisms that we need to put in place to encourage people to turn up, to actually start wanting to know more about what their environment is, what some of the issues are. So even though at this stage we haven't got a strong social science connection, we've actually got those building blocks in process now, and we've actually recently just set up a social science hub, well, about to set up a social science hub, connecting more widely with the different types of social sciences in which we can actually draw on that right at the very start of our processes, as well as when you move into implementation. So the reality is there's a really strong need for a number of different sciences over and above what we had before. We certainly concentrated around the biophysical space. As you heard from John, a lot of the more accurate information revolved around the quantity side. And if you look at, if you remember John's diagram, the knowledge network, you'll see it's very complex, and in a biological system that complexity is very hard to actually narrow down to a particular component. So this is information that people need to understand in some ways. And I guess our biggest shift about a year and a half, 2 years ago, was to make a decision where we actually work in partnership with iwi around our science provision. And even though that sounds simple, we're still not quite sure how that works. And this is with iwi as well. And we're working through the process of how that may actually happen. The last thing on this side I would need to say is there's actually a capacity issue, and that's actually a capacity within the community as well. And Alastair may draw on that when he talks about the Whaitua process. There's a few people in the community that understand and want to be involved, and they, with the number of processes involved, at play at the moment, they all are drawn a variety of ways. So finding out what is actually the best use of their time is something that they're all grappling with. So these are our scientists. They probably look more like jelly beans, but nonetheless, we have a few of them. One of the key things we've been working on in recent times is that we operate as more of a conduit into other organisations, into other institutes, to ensure that we can actually provide that mechanism to get science out into the community to enable those decisions to take place. So we've been working a lot around how we might set up collaborative science processes, how we may work in partnership, and that's primarily we're doing that at the moment with iwi, but that also means that we're actually partnering with other people, and we've got central government and some industry in which we actually work closely with. The future, as far as I see it, from a regional council science perspective, is strongly linking to both the community, community science processes and iwi science, enabling a sort of a 3 to 4 way group that actually provides the amount of information to make the future decisions which will be necessary. Relying solely on one particular component won't probably give you the amount of information you need to have. One of the components we've been grappling with over a number of years is this thing around trust. And the trusting science is when you listen to a number of presentations talking about uncertainty. How can you trust uncertainty? Well, there's actually papers written on that, so if you like to read them. But the main point is that we've been in a contentious process, and so that trust doesn't seem to have been there between scientists. So one way of actually working through that is actually if you work in a more collaborative sense and actually identify those issues right at the start, you start unravelling that and you present a more unified approach to things, and you actually identify the real issues that are actually at play. There's certainly a need to be very rigorous around this, and in our first Whaitua, we've been trying to identify all the different data sources, the quality of those data sources, making what you could call an informal official data set that everybody agrees is the right data set to actually use. And one thing that we were really, it's about 10 one things. Another thing was to meet some general principles on how we will actually apply our science over time. So we've moved definitely from...
Could you just stand a little closer to the microphone, to that one,
I think I'm taller than the other people. One thing that we've certainly noticed over the last few years is that there's a move away from just inter and intradisciplinary science. We now talk more about multidisciplinary, and certainly to actually solve some of the problems in the future we'll be getting to transdisciplinary approaches. And one of the great things is you actually start learning a lot of new words, which everybody gets horribly confused about. But there is an element that you need to upskill and actually inform people in some of the appropriate terms that are needed, because they're not going to go away, and some of them are actually important to actually get your head around. And sometimes just those complicated words actually start some really good conversations. And Wikipedia searches and Google searches. Another point to make is that science historically has been seen as the almost leading these processes. And John alluded to that before. He said it actually is to service the community for their decision-making processes. I'd like to step it back a wee bit further from that, in that there is actually, at play in New Zealand is what I've called two knowledge systems. There's the Māori knowledge system that has certainly a long traditional, a long time in history that could be drawn upon. And then there's what I colloquially call the cosmopolitan knowledge system, which is the smorgasbord of different knowledges that have been brought into New Zealand from a number of places. And both those will overlap at some places, but in certain areas they actually are specific to those particular cultures that we have here. Science actually helps provide a mechanism to bridge some of that information, to tie some of that information together, but it can also be used to recognise that they are actually different and they need to be treated as different sources of knowledge. What I've seen over the last number of years is a distinct drill down to some detail issues, and I think Andrew raised that quite well before, in that there's actually a lot of knowledge that can be drawn upon to actually make some really robust future decisions in managing to those problems. So it's not being drawn too much into one particular element. I haven't got the diagram here today, but in the past I've identified the different types of values you have and where we actually perpetuate our information sources. So we get fixated on one particular element or parameter that actually is then given the illusion that it drives the entire world. I could comment on nitrogen, but I won't. Ecosystems are way more complex than that, and there's a lot of different drivers involved. And so depending on what the objectives or the goals of the community are, they may actually have a different suite of knowledge that actually is needed to provide them to get to the state in the future they want to be. And again, that probably draws on the need to recognise timescales more adequately, which hasn't been well recognised in a lot of our processes, where if you look at the Schedule 1 process, we're really looping every 10 years and then re-looking at the same information in a slightly different way, rather than looking at where we need to be in 50, 100, 200 years' time. So this is how we do science at Greater Wellington Regional Council at the moment. It used to be much simpler. I was talking to someone before that we used to have the scientist years ago, and they did air, water, land, and it was much easier because they always had the answer to the question that you raised, which was fairly naive questions usually. So we've moved on a bit from that, and nearly every council I know in New Zealand at the moment has actually built capacity, not to actually create more positions for just doing more science, but a lot of it has been creating the critical mass in which you can actually engage properly, not only with communities but also within the research institutes. So the wonderful diagram. We've done things like developing a regional council research strategy, and that's actually right across all the functions we do. So it covers transport, some of the economic work we do, certainly the water space, hazards. So we're actually looking at it from our region perspective. What do we need to actually provide ideas for research to be done, and in some cases hopefully assist in some funding some of that. We have an internal working group that provides input into that. This big round circle here is where the council science department actually sits at the moment. We have a science steering committee that's being formed at the moment, which is actually external stakeholders that actually provide input into what the science direction could be. So we're expecting some interesting conversations around that. And we also got an internal steering committee and we're one of the sort of medium-sized councils. I guess we've got 450, 500 people covering a wide range of functions. So we have a lot of internal clients, and our science model very much is around servicing clients. So we're getting better at asking what the questions are that you would want information provided for, and then do we actually need that sort of information, or is it a whole different aspects of knowledge that you actually need? It's very easy to fall into the trap of just going, we can provide information for that, but it may be an actually better better fitted within a different realm. We formed ourselves a science leaders groups, which I'll talk about just in a minute. We did what every good organisation should do. We developed a strategy. We've got vision, mission, goals and objectives, and so there we've actually developed a implementation plan around that, and that's what I've seen from a lot of places is quite a step that's missing. Often strategies are developed, but there's no implementation plan or commitment to that afterwards. So over the last 3 years, we've made a lot of commitment into revisiting the 4 goals we have within our strategy to make sure we're actually playing out. And part of that is sometimes we just don't have the resource to actually enter into that, but we're getting there. Then we have the science delivery, and as I mentioned before, there's 4 different sort of communities at the bottom. We've got our own regional council, monitoring and science, but you've also got research providers that actually can provide information into that process, and we certainly partner with them in many ways. Mana whenua, again a source of information, and the partnership there is to identify how they can assist some of our information needs, and then how can we assist some of their information needs, and potentially joint reporting processes, and just actually delivering information that fits the purpose at hand. And this is a significant departure, and I think most councils at the moment, a preponderance of this state of the environment information that was only designed at a sort of regional scale, but now being asked local or catchment specific or even reach specific questions that it was never designed to. So it's a matter of actually what is important and then developing programs around that. And a large part of our science delivery for the next 10 years, Alastair, is around the providing information for the Whaitua. And the third component I'll talk about later is our modelling process. So this is our science leaders group. I think there's 2 others there. We formed a science leaders group to assist the council in making some of their science decisions, but more importantly to connect with the science community. So we've got a lot of these Crown Research Institutes. We've got a couple of other institutes, and a number of universities that actually provide a sounding board around some things, and it's a 2-way process. We're actually identifying how this region can actually be used as a mechanism for exploring some experimental ideas, to assist in actually exploring some future science needs, but also internally to actually give us that robustness and that checkboard around some of our things. It's also recognising that we don't necessarily know all the people that are in this business, so by connecting more widely, we're actually starting to bridge those gaps. And one of the significant areas that we knew we were very light on was around the social sciences, so now we're actually getting some very good connections within the universities and a couple of the CRIs, and that'll be an area which many people in the council are asking for more input from. How do you actually work with people? How do you actually influence behaviours? How do you actually find out what they're actually wanting? How do you actually even ask the questions, and how do you translate the questions? So many of those things that actually, from a biophysical point of view, you can always narrow it down to some parameter that they actually need to know something about, but actually might be much wider and broader than that. That's just sort of a reiteration of what I just said. This is actually more of our internal linear process around what we're providing as far as the whole way the science works. We provide input into policy, we provide input into various other guidance documents that come through. We have a long-term plan which we're in the middle of, and hopefully if that's all successful, we have an opportunity to actually provide some more science for next year. And the usual things, health and safety. We're actually focusing a lot at the moment around the communication side of things. The 4 goals we had as far as our council science area went was we wanted to provide leadership around environmental science. We wanted to provide good communication mechanisms. Whatever we provide has to be robust, fit for purpose, and we wanted to partner with iwi to ensure that we're actually meeting all the community's needs and providing both knowledge systems in which we could actually provide some very good future science. So this is the part where I hand it over to Alastair.
You will have heard the word Whaitua bandied around a little bit today. Very, very simply, in this context, Whaitua means catchment. So some of you might have been mystified by that term. Greater Wellington has divided the region into 5 Whaitua. In concept, these are very, very similar to the zones in Canterbury. They are loosely around some of the large catchments. The largest one is the Ruamahanga in the Wairarapa on the eastern part of the catchment. The other Whaitua are centred around Wellington Harbour, around Pairua Harbour, the eastern coast and the Kapiti coast. It's actually worth dwelling just for a second on the differences across the region and the differences across those Whaitua. The Ruamahanga Whaitua, which is where we've started in terms of a collaborative process and have been going for about a year now, is a large rural catchment with a fairly small, relatively small population and a rural community. In contrast with Pairua, which we've just started that process. That's a very urban community, a very, very diverse community. Certainly community-wise, they're very, very different. And the biophysical nature of those two catchments are vastly different. Vastly different issues, vastly different community. And as a consequence of that, in detail, the processes which we will go through will be different. And that's actually really, really important. The principles are the same in terms of the collaborative process, but because of the differences both in the catchment and the communities, the processes have to be different as a consequence. What is the process? Basically, it's a fairly what we now call a standard collaborative process. It's a partnership across the council, iwi, territorial authorities, and the community. The sort of model which we're operating in is that the territorials and iwi have a seat at the collaborative table. The rest of the people around the collaborative table are citizens from the community. It's fairly similar to the Canterbury model in that regard. People make application to be on the Whaitua committee, and we choose those people on the basis of getting a good spread of interests. You can't have all farmers or all fish and game people or whatever. You need a range of interests across that. Also, we've also looked for a range in terms of some spread in geographic terms. And we've even been bold in terms of actually thinking about gender balance and age and things like that, which is quite novel. But perhaps we've been only partly successful in that space. It's basically our method for implementing the MPS. We've got 5 Whaitua to get through by 2025. So each process is roughly 2 years, and everybody knows these things are very resource hungry. We actually have the resources to run 2 of these at once, and we've staggered them. And that's actually quite an important point. We'll wait till one finishes before the next one gets underway. As I said, the Ruamahanga Whaitua is the first one off the block, Pairua is next, and then we'll be moving to probably the hardest one, which is Wellington Harbour, with quite an interesting mix of issues. The Whaitua Committee is charged with producing a Whaitua implementation program, a WIP, very, very similar to our friends in Canterbury who have a ZIP, sort of almost rhymes, and then we'll go into the plan change process from that point. I think probably one of the important things, just to pick up on a couple of points that were made earlier, in terms of the science and modelling input into the process, the Whaitua Committee is the client, and Graham will probably mention this again. The modelling group are the people who provide the answers. So it's the Whaitua group themselves who decide what attributes, what values need to be looked at. They ask the questions, and the modelling group provides the answers. There obviously needs to be a conversation in that place, so that the questions that they ask aren't stupid questions and perhaps can be answered, and those sorts of things. So it actually requires that conversation. Where you go, Graham?
Okay, the collaborative modelling project. A number of people have certainly asked, why did I even go here with this one? But a year ago, no, almost a year and a half ago, we thought there's actually a different way of approaching modelling for the region, rather than just provide an RFP that goes out to through a tendering process. You come up with the consultant that says they can deliver everything. We thought there's actually a huge amount of expertise across a wide range of research organisations that we need to draw upon. And there's also, there was a lot of observed tensions between a lot of those organisations and how they actually have worked in the past or have difficulty working at the moment because of maybe the understanding, timescales, spatial differences, or whatever it is. So we thought, okay, what we should do is set up something like a modelling hub where we're actually accessing all the modellers that we need to actually provide answers to the questions that will come out from the Whaitua process. It was also to ensure that whatever we did was being done in a robust and rigorous manner to actually be fit for the purpose that was there, and also recognising that large word that everybody is scared of, which is around uncertainty, how you actually work through that, and how can you make decisions based on the sort of uncertainty that's there, because decisions inevitably are going to be made. So how can we provide the best input into that, and also identify at which stages some of those decisions may be able to be made more robust. And certainly when you're getting into managing in limits or managing to achieve certain objectives, then that is definitely needed. So I've always liked to think we've got, well, I do think there's 3 stages to our modelling process. The first stage is around providing model input to look at scenario testing. So you've heard over the last day and a bit those sorts of information, that they're the types of models that exist and where they actually can play out. So interesting enough, when I was seeing everybody pop up here over the last day and a half, I thought, oh, actually most of these guys are in our modelling hub, but I don't think there's anybody that really wasn't. So we've actually seemed to have nailed enough people probably, and they seem to know what they're saying. The second phase is actually the limit setting, and a lot of these models may actually be the same that go into that, looking at limit setting, but it's quite narrow, and as Andrew said, it's actually conversations may need to be broader than that, and models that we're putting together are actually trying to assist in answering those. And then the third stage, which is after the Whaitua has made its recommendations, it's gone through the acceptance, policy changes, or whatever needs to take place, how are we actually going to enable that the science that's provided actually is used to provide feedback into those processes to identify that we are tracking along the right way, or whether tweaks are needed, is to provide some certainty within time bands, and to actually be quite upfront around what some of the realities around that. The managing expectations is certainly a significant component of any of these processes. So these are not lemmings, these are some of the modellers that we put together at the first workshop. I think it was in December 2013. That gives you an idea that even getting a group of scientists together and actually working through how these will fit into a process takes actually a long time. So these processes, when you're starting to work in a social context, actually take a lot of input and effort to actually get running. So our first exercise around this modelling hub was colloquially called a mosh pit. So we've got all together over 3 days and work through some problems about how different models could actually work, the interoperability problems that are often faced, what are the scales some of these models can be used at, what are better at the end process as opposed to the beginning of a process, what are the data needs, what can you do in the absence of some information. And so we've progressed that. The first workshop was really just for modellers with some iwi input. We had a number of Māori researchers there, but our local kaitiaki were only a peripheral presence. We've since then worked more closely with them to identify from a local scale as well as our regional scale how kaitiaki want to actually play out in this space, what sort of questions they may have and what sort of information they may have that actually feeds into this process. And as I said before, we're currently looking at how our partnership works in science around that, and it's certainly quite hard because neither of us exactly know how that actually works because we've got different knowledge systems that are actually useful at different scales across different continuums. So we're actually doing reasonably well in that space now. We've actually, and I was a couple of slides further on, actually identify how we've actually looked at a holistic framework for the region and specifically for the Ruamahanga on how this modelling stuff will play out. So you've seen this one a number of times, and I guess it'll probably be a favourite for a lot of scientists over the next few years as they identify how complex their environment is. And as some of the tools, as John had pointed out, actually can break this down and actually make it quite usable and useful for people. And it very much is around having that conversation at the start, identifying what your environment looks like and how it all fits together. And this is actually not just a biophysical question, this is actually a social and economic question as well. And the cultural aspect of any of our communities is actually quite large in Greater Wellington, like it would be in every other region. So we've, over the last, 4 or 5 months, developed what we call an overarching knowledge framework. And this is drawing on those 2 sets of knowledge that I talked about, the cosmopolitan and the Māori knowledge system. What we're endeavouring to do is enable an organisation of the knowledge and the knowledge that is used to inform the limit setting and the future objectives that they may have. It's a holistic approach, and when we started down this route, we really started connecting with the iwi on a different level. The understanding from a more of a systems, process, and certainly in a holistic manner was much easier than it was with a lot of the other communities, and they provided a huge amount of assistance in how this would actually be framed. So this is a sort of a culmination of our work with iwi around how a conceptual replicable knowledge framework could be utilised across the region. So there's the bigger diagram. So for the Ruamahanga, we've actually got 5 principles that our modelling has to adhere to. We've got Kia Te Kitai, which is connectedness, mountains to sea, Wairuatanga, which is around identity, Katiakatanga, which is the guardianship, Tuamato Whakapona, which is a judgment based on knowledge, and Mahi Tahi, which is the partnership. So we're applying these 5 principles across the work we do, and we're actually only starting to understand how this actually works through. Early on I talked about the 2 knowledge systems, so we've diagrammatically represented them more akin to the partnership we actually have. And probably the quote right at the bottom, which is fine if you're actually standing here, is Nā tō roro, nā tāku roro ka ora o te ATY, which is with your basket and my basket, the people will thrive. So it's very much about the different knowledge systems providing the information that you can make good resource decisions on. And within there's always a shared knowledge as well as 2 specific knowledges that come together. Our modellers are actually in the midst of this at the moment. John just before mentioned about the quantity side that we're actually starting to get a handle on, that's actually out now to get approval for. But what we established quite early on in our last workshop, was just after Christmas, is that you have a lot of information, you have a lot of models you're using. How do they actually tie together? Who are the people that actually tie that together? So our local kaitiaki, some Māori researchers, and some of the modellers are actually who are good in the space of integrating, and what we call, we've got integrators and weavers now, and they're there to provide how does the two knowledge systems actually aid in this process, and how does it actually assist the scenario building, the limit setting, the managing the environment and for the objectives that have been set. So we've got our classic groups. We've got a biological subgroup, a land use economic subgroup, chemophysical, hydrogeomorphological, and social cultural. The latter one we're still developing through, and we've found that over the last year and a bit that we've been doing this, that it's become iterative. We think we've just about got the problem identified or the system solved, and then work out that actually we're missing a significant chunk of knowledge that needs to be put into this process. So the option then is, do you ignore it or do you actually incorporate it? And we've taken the view that it does actually need to be incorporated, otherwise you're left with a lot of people uncertain about what the decision is actually being made. As Alastair mentioned, our Whaitua committee is our client in this case, and certainly if you remember a few minutes ago, our science is to actually serve clients as opposed to actually providing science for ourselves. Probably enough now. So in a more simplified way, this is the catchment, and all around you'll see, if you could see, there's actually different models that are actually being identified as necessary to actually solve some of the interactions or some of the processes that need to take place. So this one is very much more like a process diagram at the moment. It's around the models that can be used to understand how the whole sort of ecosystem actually operates. There is further demand for other types of models in the future. They'll be around how you may actually work within the community on the appropriate behavioural changes, or identifying how the information can be better utilised. And all around it we're cognizant that we always need to ensure that the 5 principles are being met. And so it's going to be interesting over the next year or so how that actually plays out. I'm sure there's going to be lots of discussions occur around this, but hopefully this process is robust enough that everybody believes they've actually got the right say and the right input into the decision-making process. Just telling me I've done now. John threw this up before. That's where we're at the moment with one of these subgroups. We've actually drilled it down to what are the model suite we need to actually answer some of the questions that we're anticipating. We're still very much in this, we're not quite sure what's going to be asked of us, so you've got to actually formulate something, because when they say we would like an answer in 3 weeks, you can't necessarily go out and reconvert a model that might take 6 months and condense that in 3 weeks. We have tried that, it doesn't seem to work. So it's spacing it adequately so that you're actually anticipating some of the questions, but recognising that you may not have got them all, and it's not actually your job to tell them that they haven't actually asked the right question. It's actually, you need to be reasonably sincere about what the limitations of and what the time requirements will be to actually get to that next stage. So, my last slide. In all these processes, you always have to have a governance structure. That's where it was much easier a few years ago. You didn't seem to have as many people involved. It seemed to be much easier. So our modelling project actually has a governance group. We have some significant partners. We have MFE and MPI providing support and some funding for some of our work, and also taking a lead on some of the areas of the modelling. iwi is a significant partner in this process, and as I mentioned, we will and continue to work on around what that partnership will look like and how it will actually unfold. Project team, typically we replicate within each of these the types of, so the governance group consists of our partners and some key staff within council and also myself, I think. Project team, we actually assigned a lead model to this process, which was independent, and we've done that with our science leaders group. We have an independent chair for these to ensure that we at least we're observed to be actually doing all the right processes. We've actually got checks on ourselves as well as everybody else. Modelling teams, you've seen those, quite complex, a number of them. We have in our modelling hub at the moment 35 to 40 different modellers, and we haven't even explored some of the areas. Now some of these don't actually get a part to play as far as writing script, running a model. They're there for either a peer review process or to look at some of the assumptions that might be being made and to actually help that process. So it's very resource hungry around that. We're aware that there is actually a limit of these people in New Zealand, and so endeavouring to ensure that our process is not necessarily going to unhinge everybody else's processes around the country, and that in many cases we've had industry say, look, we'd love to be there but we can't because commitments to times and stuff. So we've actually come up with some alternative arrangements like specific peer reviews around specific things. And our local kaitiaki group is ensuring that we actually are getting the best knowledge and the best approach to some of our work, and to make sure that when results come out through our modelling hub or through the and we've got these integrators and weavers, that it's still all ground tested. So that is us.